You're about to watch my podcast with Arijit Patra. Arijit is one of the leading figures when it comes to AI and machine learning, and specifically the applications this could have in the pharmaceutical industry. I could go over his resume, but it's just so large that we would need 10 minutes just talking about what he has done. We discussed about AI and how AI works, the place AI has and should have in the society, how AI is being used in the pharmaceutical industry to discover drugs, but also to manufacture drugs. We talked about AI in healthcare and how it could completely transform longevity. We discussed a little bit about Brian Johnson. And lastly, he shared some thoughts of having traveled 93 countries. This episode is the first ever I am uploading. While I have also filmed other podcast episodes, I felt like this needed to be the first one. This is the Life and Wellness Unlocked podcast. Welcome. Are you ready to dive into AI?
Absolutely.
Right. Could you talk a little bit about what do you do?
Well, currently, so I'm mostly interested in AI from a very specific aspect of the drug development process. So I work in a pharma company where I lead a lot of the AI efforts around specifically non-clinical safety evaluations. So what happens is, obviously today it's not exactly news that AI can be used for a lot of different things to varying amounts of efficiency. And key industry where a lot of the difference is being made as we speak is in the drug development and the pharmaceutical industry. Like while there has been a lot of obviously news about AI being used to design new molecules and similar, there are other fundamental parts of the drug development pipeline that need some amount of intervention with regards to, better understanding of the biology underlying, and from there on to anything around automation of some of the processes and so on and so forth. So I look
Right.
at
So in a nutshell, let's start with a definition. Like, how would you define AI to somebody who doesn't know anything about it? What is AI in simple words?
honestly, if you ask me, like the phrase AI is doesn't really have a definition today.
Yeah.
Like it's let me put it this way. It's what you would be, talking about when you have no idea of what you are actually wanting to talk about. So anyone can talk about artificial intelligence these days to mean that gray box which they have no idea about, somehow impairing things in a manner that, they have no clue. In a sense, like the phrase AI today has become similar to phrases like, deep state or government's conspiracy and things.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a shame. To make it a little more scientific, if we have to go back, let's say a few decades prior, how did we get to this point? We should talk about a term known as machine learning and more appropriately something known as statistical learning. So,
So what is the difference between like neural networks and deep learning and all these terminologies that are being thrown around?
once again, a lot of terminologies. There is a whole of a word soup. So we will take them one by one. First, machine learning. So the idea, the core of this phrase machine learning is in the word learning. So what does it mean to learn? To learn means to actually acquire information in a manner that such information can be used for downstream decision making or in pattern recognition. So the idea was that if humans can do it, humans can naturally do it, can non-human entities or non-animal entities have similar properties? So this was a tantalizing question that was asked in the 1940s actually. And you'd be surprised that this was not computer scientists or engineers that asked this question. It was actually cognitive psychologists. So in cognitive psychology, there is a question that we do a lot of things to try and understand how the human brain processes information, but we can't really look into the human brain. So
Yeah.
what is that next best approximation that we can have? And therein, came the question that if humans can exhibit properties like learning, are there other non-human systems that can potentially exhibit similar properties? And that led to this idea of machine
So,
learning.
I have a couple of follow up questions later about the comparison between the human brain. So, hopefully, we'll dive into that deep as well. So, what do you have to say about the science fiction concept of AI? That AI is going to become an overlord and take over humanity and all that kinds of stuff.
Come to think of it, if you want to talk about a system that can take over humanity, you will have to be able to define what is humanity itself. Do we have a
Yeah.
good definition of what is humanity? What is humanity? That's a philosophical question that has been deliberated across cultures for thousands of years now, and we don't have a clear answer. What does it mean to be human? So if we don't know what does it mean to be human, can you even talk about some other entity taking over humanity? So
Okay, that's a
it's
fair
very
point.
interesting. But
Kind
anyway,
of
I guess like
philosophical. So when you say that you train a model, you train an AI model, what exactly does it mean to train it?
so train a model is to essentially get this non-human entity, essentially a mathematical set of like operations, recognize patterns in a manner that allow it to have tractable recognition of similar patterns on a future scale without relying on the past patterns being present. So a lot of very abstract things here. Very simply put, if you were to
Yeah.
look at this idea that, you want to somehow do what is known as learning in a non-human system, one of the ways to do that would be to, somehow treat learning as a mathematical objective. And in a very particular way of doing this, known as supervised learning, the idea is that these mathematical operations can have those parameters that can be optimized to enable that Goldilocks zone of recognizing patterns that could allow this set of mathematical operations to generalize to future such emergence of patterns and lead to those outcomes that are known to be, a priori true based on a previous set of data, a previous set of observations. So this aspect is known as training.
Okay. Okay. So very straightforward. All right. That's fair. That's fair. So, like, is AI as intelligent as humans, or less intelligent, or more intelligent, and could
Once
it
again,
become more?
once again, when we ask these questions, we don't really know what we are talking about ourselves because we don't know what intelligence itself is. Is there a tractable
Let's go to the IQ aspect of intelligence.
so the IQ aspect? Now, yeah, this is where things get a bit complicated. Like when you talk about specifically the IQ aspect, because most of the standardized tests for measuring IQ have effectively relied largely on like very particular kinds of pattern recognition or very particular kinds of like spatial recognition. In a lot of
Yeah.
cases, you have machines that outperform humans, at least at least when you look at like the sort of the normal baseline of humans, a lot of algorithms today can outperform humans on those kind of tests. Now, obviously, that argument remains that to what extent IQ tests themselves are a good marker of intelligence, or
Yeah. Okay. Of course.
so that's where a lot of these questions come. Like we talk a lot about this human versus machine. We talk about Terminator scenarios. We talk about science fiction, but the fundamental idea is this: we do not really appreciate the full diversity of the human race or the human mind itself. How are you going to talk about any comparisons to mechanistic entities that we design? So at the end of the day, I think there is a bit of a more of a room to understand what natural intelligence is before you start getting all uppity about artificial intelligence.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. That's a very fair point. That's a very fair point. So, do you think that in the programming aspect of AI, are we chasing after it to catch up with understanding what it is, or are we actually leading it forward?
So as far as most of the programming aspects go, so far the most dominant paradigms, I mean, you were talking about like stuff like deep learning or neural networks earlier, it has largely been driven by a paradigm known as connectionism. So connectionism is this idea that you can have essentially nodes connected with edges, essentially like directed graphs, but not quite when you look at the mathematical sense, where every node can represent a set of parameterized operations that perform a mathematical operation known as composition. And learning those parameters essentially allows you to learn the patterns that can emerge. Either that, or in a generative sense, to actually learn from a open distribution to actually create some of those samples that it has learned from by these learned parameters. So effectively, what we are really looking at is programming these kind of like modules where these mathematical parameters can optimally be learned, either based on objective or based on some amount of like probability divergence with an open distribution, the latter case being generative. So in all of these cases, until recently, we did not really see emergent behavior, or as we would call, you know, properties that would not be ab initio explained by by the intent of the, let's say, the original developer. What we do see now is like, with a lot of particularly large language models,
Could you say this is like ChatGPT and Claude and all this stuff?
or O1s and all of that, like Mistrals, all of that. In some of this, we do see things like, the emergence of some amount of causal reasoning, and it's not very clear where it's coming from. If it is a result of the data that it was trained on, or if it is something else that we are seeing. So for me, for the question that you asked, 95% of my answer would be that we are still in the realm of where we are programming and we are still relying on essentially statistical learning over reams of data. But there is a 5% uncertainty that I have in my mind that there might be some amount of emerging behavior that we see that we can't really explain straight up by, hard coding some of the stuff that we write.
Okay, that's very interesting to see that emerging. But could you say the biggest turning point for AI was the way it initiated from psychology in the 1940s?
So yeah, there is a bit of a
Yeah.
background to that. Like you asked about neural networks earlier. So once again, the first neural networks are not constructed by computer scientists. They're constructed by cognitive psychologists. The first one was in 1954 by, I believe it was Robin McCollum, if I'm not wrong. And it was essentially designed, neural networks, as being like some level of a proxy for neuronal pathways in the human brain. Now we know with absolute certainty that neural networks are by far not an appropriate representation of the human brain. At best, might be like a cartoon representation of how neurons actually work, but purely in terms of information abstraction, neural networks served as a tool of like conceptual understanding of how information processing might work in the realm of like
Yes, it's a model. It's a model, like all other models in science. Yeah, it's still a model.
this was picked up in the 1964 Dartmouth Conference on AI, which was one of those first conferences where this tantalizing question of can machines learn was substantially addressed. This was posed as one of those potential ways of like, imparting the concept of learning and intelligence in non-human systems. And at the time, this approach, like neural networks and other connectionist approaches, were competing with a class of approaches known as symbolism. So, like a lot of the approaches of like learning symbolic logic or learning logical workflows through symbolic manifestations thereof. And
But is it that the AI understands actually what the symbols mean, or knows how to describe?
it was somewhere in between actually at the time. Like you had essentially a lot of the symbolism used to identify or hardcode essentially elements of logic into mechanistic systems. That was what symbolism at the time was really about. But what happened was that at the time, you did not really get a lot of currency for neural networks for the next 20 years, 30 years thereafter, because it was not clear how you could actually find enough data to train them on or find enough compute to train them on. A lot of it in 1986 when you got the first ever backpropagation algorithm. It was out of a master's thesis actually by David Rumelhart, which actually described how you could use gradient flows and gradient descent as an optimization algorithm that could train such connections of neurons. So connectionism actually picked up once again following this discovery. And eventually, in the 90s and the early 2000s, once again, there was not enough data, but all of it changed in 2012 when essentially the world discovered GPUs and the fact that GPUs could be used for parallel computing to actually train some of these large amounts of like, neuronal circuitries using sort of large scale amounts of data. So the credit of this goes to someone known as Alex Krzyzewski. So Alex Krzyzewski was a PhD student at University of Toronto. He spent close to 1.5 years in his basement trying to get parallelization using GPUs to work. And the world owes a lot to him because that is what heralded the present revolution of connectionism, which is where deep learning was born. Fundamentally, deep learning is nothing but learning using multiple layers of connectionist assemblies like neural networks. So a deep neural network is fundamentally neural networks that have more than one layer essentially.
Okay, okay. And is that the same in simple models? And like we saw recently, I think the first quantum computers being made from NVIDIA, from Microsoft, being able to harness like super power within just a couple centimeters, uh, yeah, space. Is it the same technology, only more advanced, or is it completely different from simpler AI models?
We are talking about slightly different topics here. Like when you talk about most of quantum computing circuitries, you are really talking about essentially, being able to go beyond what are known as hybrid classical quantum systems to actually pure quantum states. But that that line of discussion is slightly tangential to deep learning or artificial intelligence because you do see very strong intersections today. Like quantum machine learning is a thing, quantum deep learning is a thing. Doesn't work very well in a lot of cases, but in some cases, like in pharmaceutical drug discovery, specifically in modeling, for example, like chemical reaction uncertainties, quantum machine learning has shown quite a lot of promise. So slightly different topics, but there is a strong intersection to that is increasingly being discovered.
Okay, okay. So, is there potential? Do we know anything about what potential could exist in AI? What is the ceiling that we could reach or no?
Well, I mean, one of the ceilings that is often quoted is this idea of a singularity. Like, when artificial general intelligence becomes intelligent enough that it is indistinguishable from, let's say, the larger human society. But if you ask me, I don't think like there is a possible like understanding of what singularity might look like. So if you ask me, the ceiling would essentially be the emergence of like causal reasoning and independent behavior essentially. So for example, you look at babies. Like when babies are born, they are born essentially with limited knowledge, at least something, they're not really taught a lot of things, but they do learn to figure out through exploration and exploitation how to navigate their way in the world, even without explicitly being taught to do a lot of these things. So the moment you have algorithms or say any of these foundation models or language models or multimodal models, whatever, the moment they're able to demonstrate this kind of behavior, where they're able to interact with like so what are known as world models or open world data and come up with essentially independent judgment and independent reasoning, that would be the holy grail moment for me.
So, is that a conversation of consciousness as well?
Once again, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know how to define consciousness. Like the philosophical definitions of consciousness, all of them end up in a recursive loop across cultures, across philosophies. And when you talk about this idea of consciousness as being able to take in and impact your surroundings and feel one with it, maybe if an algorithm is able to kind of take independent action based on its interactions with open world data without explicitly being trained for it, that may be some form of consciousness that it might demonstrate at that point.
Yeah, there's also the conversation of the fact that we perhaps live in a simulation, and we will never even know it. But let's talk.
And if you live in a simulation, Roman, if you live in a simulation, I don't see much value of knowing whether we live in a simulation or not. I mean, the simulation
Yeah,
will
that's a point.
provide
That's a
you.
fair point to make. Even if we wanted to find out, I don't think there is any way of.
Not everything needs to be done.
Yeah, that's true. What role do you think AI has and or should have in the society?
Look, at the end of the day, a lot depends on what societies we are really talking about because it is one of
Let's
those.
talk about the Western civilization for start. You know.
A lot of modern Western civilization is heavily predicated on the idea of like essentially, philosophies of Kant and Spinoza and similar philosophers where, there is a very strong preponderance on material prosperity and the material world. And normally in that kind of a setting where the individual is seen as the front and center of everything, or rather the front and center of the social contract that you have with society, something like, a disruptive technology like artificial intelligence or similar, particularly in the context of, these technologies causing large scale displacement of jobs and employment and increasingly shaping how society perceives and thinks. I would think that you are really looking at trying to have AI systems as assistive technologies. You are really looking at trying to have these systems as, being creators of new forms of like creative output and new forms of like, say, productive enablement of the individual. And you're really looking at mitigating some of the more, um, sort of like surface level harms that algorithms might cause in terms of things like misinformation, etc. Because when you're talking about essentially an individual centered society or a society that predicates significantly on individual reasoning, you do not want that idea of reason to be contaminated or that idea of free will to be contaminated by external stimuli without having appropriate checks and balances on it. And therefore, like
Yes,
the
but again, there's the question that if your whole worldview can be so easily influenced by AI, it probably isn't that stable and foundational in the first place.
that is true. But the thing is that we have to appreciate that, particularly the way Western societies have been shaped with so much of empowerment of the individual and individual will, it kind of like takes for granted the role of the, the surrounding in shaping such worldview and shaping such will. And as such, if you have algorithmic interventions to the surrounding itself without appropriate checks and balances, then you do not really bring the individual to the state where their foundational, sort of ethos is sufficiently strong enough. And as such, like, manipulation is only a matter of time that way. I mean, we
Yeah.
can look from another lens actually, like, you can look at it from a more positive lens. I mean, we are talking about a lot of applications of AI today that can have significant efficiency gains in things ranging from healthcare to security to, you know, say for example, like, um, today you can have much more expedited like healthcare screenings. You can have much more expedited social media delivery. You can have like more efficient e-commerce delivery and optimization of like different freight routes and things like that. All of those are like, you know, great benefits of technologies in a manner that would have looked like absolute science fiction, to let's say the generation above us. All of those are fantastic gains. And at that point, like since the more pecuniary and sundry gains to society have been thought about and are already very clear, the question is how you preserve those gains without letting them compromise on the sustainability of the society itself. And
What's
that is,
your answer? How?
well, look, I mean, at the end of the day, the question to be asked is that when you are having kind of particular kinds of technological transformations, and that too at such a short notice as we see today, to what extent are the custodians of the societies where such transformations being affected cognizant of the opinions and the thoughts and the requirements of the members of those very societies? In a sense, if you were to look at the social organization, let's say in the West, when you have essentially individuals coming together and forming the society as we know it, and you have elected representatives as de facto custodians of that society, it is incumbent upon members of both, the people who are essentially the elected representatives, let's say, or I mean, the equivalent would be the patricians of ancient Rome versus the plebeians, and essentially members of the society to be very cognizant of the impact of the technological transformation they are bringing in and use the mechanics of the state that they have at their disposal, things like legislative control, things like, selective encouragement, or things like allowing for the right amount of innovation. All of that, are tools available at the disposal to chart the course of the technological adoption in a manner it doesn't cause, large scale disruption that just has a runaway reaction.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. So let's simplify for a moment. How about the question everybody's mom has? Will AI replace our jobs?
A lot of the jobs, yes. Classic
Okay.
example.
What are going to be the first job that get replaced?
Well, I mean, we saw that with ChatGPT, a lot of the copywriting jobs disappeared overnight. And we actually saw this on a lot of freelancing platforms. You had a very steep decline in a lot of these, copywriting and proofreading jobs overnight. So as such, like we did see very strong examples of particular kinds of employment being susceptible at a moment's notice. So I would think that any job that does not require, you know, engaging in the creative side of your mind or engaging with other humans or kind of like modulating the uniquely human ability of flexibly cooperating in large numbers, any of those jobs that do not require these three things are susceptible to disruption.
But again, in creativity, you see AI making unbelievably good music, art, all that stuff, which is a creative work.
Yeah, but then again, like, algorithms can't really express the emotion behind the creativity, and that is where uniquely the history comes in, role of creativity comes in. It was never about the medium. I mean, honestly, you could create fantastic music even without AI using a lot of like, stuff like auto tuning, etc. that you had back in the day. You had a lot of software that you could actually create a lot of music even without current algorithms. But it was always the artist and that artistic insight and that artistic, ethos that actually made music special. So that is why creativity, because it kind of transcends the mechanistic aspect of the production of that creative output, that is why it will actually survive any scourge of AI adoption.
But again, there is a concern of mine that perhaps we're becoming too dependent on AI, because I see it all the time in university, from friends, from even teachers. Teachers use AI to grade papers that students used AI to write. Like it's very funny. Do you think we're becoming too dependent? Maybe.
At the end of the day, we are really good at becoming dependent on new exciting technology really fast. Like for no reason, people got dependent on a bloody iPhone, like, since 2007. So that's the human condition, to get dependent on technology for no reason. I'm very sure if we had enough archaeological excavations, you would find stories of some of the ancient Greeks becoming too dependent on Antikythera and teachers and students complaining about it. And a funny example here, I'll give you an example. So when I went for my undergrad in India, till about second year of undergrad, we were not allowed to use calculators in our exams. We had to, hand calculate everything. Whereas it would seem logical that, using calculators is such an efficiency gain. So that debate is always, to what extent should you do things from first principles, and to what age and to what level of formation of your mind, versus actually relying on technical tools that aid the efficiency of the process, like, calculators or ChatGPT or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is a debate that doesn't really have a very clear answer. And that's a debate that can go on till the end of time.
I mean, we do see some lines being drawn in the way that if somebody uses Google Maps all the time and doesn't have any
They lose a sense of
navigation, his hippocampus is gonna
yeah.
become atrophied like at some point.
No, what
But
worries what worries me is this: like, if you do get too dependent on easy solutions, or if you use technologies that are meant to assist you all the time. Say, for example, if you can't string a sentence together or write a long paragraph without using ChatGPT, it kind of has far-reaching implications beyond that activity itself. Because we do know there is a reliable amount of research now that things like, being mentally agile with mathematical calculations, or with learning more languages, or being able to, you know, write stories, etc., that has far-reaching implications towards warding off things like dementia and all of that. And today we are creating an entire generation where they can't string a sentence together using ChatGPT. So you are really creating essentially what can very well become a public health emergency in the next 50 years. And that is something that I would be more worried about.
yes, that is something very worrying for sure. Let's talk about something else in terms of AI and society, which is also worrying, which is the connection people start to form with AI models. You saw it in China, first of all, where you had kids use ChatGPT as their therapist or maybe even friend instead of real people. And then you have it in the more extreme form with AI girlfriends.
You know, I should actually take a step back here. And so I'm from West Bengal in India, and the Bengali movie industry was quite famous for creating cult classics in the 60s and 70s. And there was a movie director by the name of Mrinal Sen, and he was more of a noir film director, like, more of the postmodernist noir film director. And one of his most acclaimed movies is about a man who fell in love with his car. So, and the title of the movie, when you translate it, literally translates into "not a machine." So, essentially, this idea of forming emotional connection. Once again, the question to be asked: Why do I have to form an emotional connection only with humans? So that's also a question that there isn't exactly a very strong philosophical answer for. What worries me is this, and this is something I talked about last year in a lecture as well. A lot of the reason why generative models are being used as therapists, for example, in China, is, and also in India for that matter, is because in a lot of these cultures, it's deeply a taboo to talk about mental health.
Yeah, stigmatized. Yeah.
So much so that you don't really have the adequate vocabulary in a lot of languages to talk about how you're feeling. And given the prospect of anonymity and individual one-to-one conversation that a lot of these artificial agents provide, they become the go-to choices. For a lot of people for whom navigating social cues is a significant challenge, and there isn't exactly a lot of social incentive to form those human connections, there is a lot of, like, social cost essentially for them to try and be themselves in the outer world. These artificial agents become a refuge. And as such, like, you have essentially the emergence of AI girlfriends or boyfriends, you have essentially AI therapists and whatnot. And this, I think, is a ticking time bomb. And a lot of, sort of like, governments and leaders of societies, etc., need to take a much closer look to this and ask a serious question that in their quest for, like, empowering the individual, have they actually caused a runaway reaction of, like, undermining the basic fundamentals of, like, self-organized societies, where you can't have individuals simply interacting with, uh, a screen essentially in front of them and not really interact with the outer world outside. So that's a question that needs to be asked.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very, very quick transformation in society happening. It first was introduced by pornography, I would say, when if you take a step back and look at it, the most popular, richest king in history could have maybe five, six, 100 wives. The average 15-year-old today can see more naked women within 2 minutes than the richest king in history. But now you have the AI girlfriends topic being introduced. It is very worrying from a psychology standpoint because somebody,
Like you are actively disincentivizing like interacting with the wider world outside beyond the digital world that you have created for yourself, because the digital world, like you talked about the pornography example, but even otherwise, like the average human today is so overstimulated by the digital world that their dopamine receptors are so conditioned to interacting with the digital that the natural looks boring. I mean,
do you think
normally,
it's a ticking time bomb that is gonna explode?
like we do know that overstimulating on dopamine never did anyone particularly a vast amount of good. Today you have a situation where people do not want to go on a hike in the mountains. They would rather sit in front of the screen and endlessly scroll their social media, and
Yeah.
that I think is a good thing overall. I mean, like overstimulating dopamine comes with serious mental health issues, and we have enough research today to actually attest to that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take it from a little bit more philosophical standpoint. I really like philosophy. In this case, I can't help my mind but to go to Plato's. For watchers and listeners who aren't familiar, Plato's cave was a theory introduced by Plato, where in the cave the prisoners saw other people only from their shadows, and they could only understand the world based on the shadows they saw, and not the actual people. So, do you think AI could introduce, if it hasn't already, this concept that you can only see what is happening based on what the AI feeds you? In terms of, I remember we had also discussed this off camera about the media and the news, but now with AI, it's way more convenient for somebody to find a piece of information, and it's also much more convenient to just read what the AI told him and form his entire perspective based on that.
I mean, honestly, I sometimes wonder if Plato were to be alive today, how would he actually think about AI as a mechanism of creating those shadows? Because if you look at the original, thought experiment of Plato, that, you essentially have a fire, and then in front of the fire, you have essentially puppets, and the puppets are controlled by dummies, and the prisoners only see the shadows. So, in a sense, like, what Plato was hinting at was essentially something that has always been true for humanity, that at any given point of time, given our deep origins, our brains are still functioning in the in the Paleolithic savanna, essentially, of our hunter-gatherer heritage, that we would always have limited information, and we have to assume all of the possibilities of that limited information that could be harmful to us and act accordingly. Therefore, we are really good at actually not looking at things within a broader context, because that is a luxury that you can only have in a fairly sedentary lifestyle. So the human brain is preconditioned almost to make decisions based on the limited information that it has, and invariably is conditioned to assume essentially the most extreme of those interpretations, which is also why, the more scandalous a story is, or the more salacious a story is, or the more anxiety inducing a story or an interpretation is, that's what sells the most. And that is almost evolutionary. If you did not have this trait, you would not survive a day in the savannah. You would see maybe a lion in the bushes. You have to assume it's a lion and prepare for it. You could not assume that, oh, this is not a lion, it's a lion that is actually just meditating and thinking about philosophy behind the bushes, would not eat me. So Plato essentially hinted at this and gave a philosophical expression that fundamentally we are all prisoners of our form, and it is only through enlightened education that you can exceed that. That was a fundamental aspect of the idea of the cave. Today, what happens is that AI has kind of like dramatically exploded the means of creating those shadows. What Plato thought about doing with puppets and fires, today you can do with pixels and GPUs in a matter of seconds. And you don't have exactly a shortage of prisoners because of the mechanisms of delivery through social media and elsewhere. So in a sense, like you are at a stage where you essentially are not only trapped in Plato's cave, but the cave itself is a never ending, kind of like an abyss where you
Yeah,
keep on.
pixelized universe. Yeah.
See, I wonder like what the philosophical implication of this would be, let's say in 1,000 years, when someone studies this phenomenon, because what, if you look at the final form of this, you are really looking at a situation where the shadows are the only reality and anything else does not exist. And therefore, no one knows a world beyond the shadows. And if you do see anything that is not the shadow, you think that itself is not a reality. That's the fake. So the fake would become real and the real becomes fake. What is
So,
the
so
final?
do you think there should be some regulation in terms of that? Not exactly the effect, which we just described, but I remember I saw a statement from Sam Altman, the CEO of ChatGPT, saying that AI is going to destroy the world, but in the meantime, there will be many successful businesses. And you also see statements from Elon Musk saying that he doesn't trust AI in the hands of different people, and we should have some government regulations.
Look, I'll tell you something, Roman. Purely as far as the destructive ability of AI algorithms, etc., go, we don't really have to focus on the esoteric or the philosophical. Let's talk about more boring, immediate examples of how AI-enabled systems are causing destruction at real time right now. Today, you have had multiple elections where there have been definite reports of misinformation. There have been definite reports of deepfakes being propagated. Today, you have AI-powered drones that are way more efficient at engaging in non-kinetic warfare than anything else we have seen in human history. And today, you have essentially the ability of creating both of these things, both of these examples that I took out of many others I could, by essentially high school kids sitting in their mom's basement with, a few $1,000s of hardware and, let's say some amount of data. So today, that is the possibility we are really talking about. And if that is where we are today, it is reasonable to assume that all of these things are being done in a very substantive manner in a lot of global fault lines that exist today. That's
Yeah.
one. The other example, today, it is possible, because I work in drug discovery and AI, those same algorithms can very well be repurposed to create new generation of chemical weapons. There was this very famous article on MIT Tech Review about someone doing exactly this as an experiment, and they came up with more ideas for, chemical warfare agents in an afternoon than in all of the last 20, 30, 50 years combined. So that algorithm spouted out new molecular structures that people hadn't really thought about, which would actually have that kind of an effect.
So, what
So,
is the effect to which this could go to?
well, I mean, at the end of the day, we have to appreciate something that take some of these things to their eventual effect on the human race. There have to be, sufficiently bad actors with the means of production of these kind of artifacts at a scale. There is no dearth of those. So that way, we can open a whole can of worms and there is no going back. What I can tell you is that today you do have, for example, weaponry that do use AI systems. You obviously have misinformation mills, etc. You have essentially a lot of efforts to counter both these things with varying degrees of success. But at some point, you have to accept that for some of these things, the genie is out of the bottle and then there is no going back. There is no way you are going to out legislate misinformation. Let's face it. And if misinformation is not an AI thing, AI just has hastened the process dramatically. Spreading political misinformation is literally the third oldest profession in humanity. Spreading rumors, yellow journalism and whatnot. So with AI, the tools have become more efficient and there is no out legislating it.
Yeah, we're in a very weird time, but sometimes I ask myself, based on history, if it's actually different than what has been happening for thousands of years. Because the human animal evolutionarily has some key characteristics which you cannot eliminate. Like fear is important because it protects you from something. So in the old times, couldn't it be with like a huge army being expanding constantly and people fearing that? But now it's in different forms and it's just repeating itself. We just think it's something new.
So the human condition is a permanent one. There is no getting out of that. The problem that we have today uniquely at this juncture in human history is that our, sort of things that we have created as a result or as a product of the human creativity or the human mind, a lot of these have become tools that can essentially cause a lot of these further creations of, human artifacts like technologies, etc., at a much more rapid pace than ever before. So in a sense, all of those aspects of the human condition that would be negotiated through technological transformation and whatnot, that process has just become dramatically more accelerated. And
Yeah.
what implications does it have? That is where the question really revolves.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this before, but have we ever seen an example of an AI wanting to keep its existence, like somebody trying to turn it off and it finds ways to keep it alive? Or have we ever seen in AI any human emotion towards survivability and all the rest?
So, and this is where things get very murky, is that we have worked with the assumption that these are essentially algorithms or machines, loosely speaking, that can only function within the remit of the training data or the data sets it has been exposed to. And any display of emotion or human-like characteristic is a function of the data it was trained on. However, at the end of that, you have to appreciate something, that a lot of the emotional judgment that we make of other people, we do it essentially on expressed feedback or expressed intent on things like that. And there have been studies now, particularly when it came to using a lot of these chat interfaces in healthcare settings, that a lot of patients reported in randomized trials that the AI chat interface had a lot more empathy and a lot more understanding than the human doctor, to the point that they mistook the AI to be the doctor and the doctor to be the AI. So this is where it gets murky. Like, if there is a sort of reproducible human feedback that an artificial agent actually shows human emotion, then can we deny that there are traits of emotion that might be an emergent property? That is where the question.
And it also goes back to the conversation there. The human animal has a dark side, which also Robert Greene talks a lot about, the writer of 48 Laws of Power. And most people try to deny it, but yeah, maybe AI is a good way to reflect on our species.
Well, I mean, if you're training an AI with human related data or human data, sooner or later the human psychology and human form gets reflected on it. And this happens with relatively less advanced systems as well. Like, there was this famous example of a chatbot which was designed to learn from user interaction, and a lot of 4chan users essentially taught it the kind of garbage that 4chan is known for, and the bot had to be shut down in 24 hours because it was essentially making way too many racist and politically incorrect statements. So that happens all the time anyway.
Let's go to the pharmaceutical industry, since you're kind of the perfect person to ask about this. You've done a lot in quantum computing, a lot in AI, and specifically the applications it could have in the pharmaceutical industry. You also work daily on the effects, if I'm not mistaken, of AI in pharmaceuticals.
Yes.
So let's talk first about AI in drug discovery and then AI in drug manufacturing. Very recently, I made my first YouTube video, and it was about the discovery of the first ever single electron covalent bond. So basically, for those who don't know the context, chemical bonds in the covalent type should have two electrons. For the first time, we discovered the chemical bond, a covalent one, with a single electron, which was only theorized by Pauling many, like almost a century ago. But the thing is, all the biochemical reactions, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me, that we know and use to develop drugs are the ones which we have identified. But the thing is, if there are more chemical bonding that takes place which we haven't identified, there could also be more chemical interactions taking place, and we just didn't have any means of measuring it. So what could AI do in terms of that?
A lot of things, actually. I mean, today, if you were to look at how we use machine learning for drug discovery itself, like in early discovery, it takes quite a few forms here. First is that you are really looking, when you're talking about a disease, for example, you're really looking at something known as, target, like the targets that can be implicated in a disease. So, for example, like if you're looking at some kind of a set of symptoms for which a certain protein expression is kind of like responsible for it, then if you can essentially mitigate the action of that protein or the expression of that protein, then you could have a viable therapeutic candidate. So that protein essentially becomes a target then, or a pathway within the expression of that protein becomes a target. So you could use machine learning to discover some of these, disease pathways and basically better understand disease biology. You could actually then design molecular structures that can be used to, bind to particular targets.
So basically, chemical interactions that in different times we would try to perform in a lab setting, but now AI could predict which chemical molecule is going to form a bond with another chemical molecule.
Yes, I mean, there is that, and also beyond that. I mean, if you were to look at, say, for example, like normally in a lab, you'd have to do these experiments in iterative fashion based on first principles understanding of chemistry. You could have a computational simulation of a lot of these, you know, reactions and reaction mechanisms and binding affinities and whatnot in parallel over a large amount of, data. So you could have a lot more throughput essentially in terms of identifying those, entities that can bind to targets appropriately and within the other constraints that you have to consider in terms of their toxicity, efficacy, and other kinds of mechanistic safety aspects, etc. So one of the things to think about here is this. Normally, when you have to talk about, for example, you have a particular protein, you have a particular protein structure, let's say, that is implicated in a particular disease, and you could do well to actually reduce the expression of that protein or, mitigate the function of that protein in a biological pathway. You could use, you could design a complementary protein to that and try to get it to bind to that. And historically, designing some of these in a pre-AI era would mean an iterative design over many, many years, for example, because you have to consider a lot of other, characteristics and a lot of other constraints, along with the fact that you need to design a complement of a particular target. And today it is possible using a lot of generative chemistry algorithms to consider a lot of these constraints and come up with a whole range of molecular structures in one afternoon. And, than was possible to do this in, let's say, a year or so. So that is the kind of efficiency gain that we're talking about in early discovery. So this is one of the ways in which machine learning has revolutionized the early discovery stage. And increasingly, there are efforts to add more and more constraints from further in the pipeline to inform this molecular design phase. Like, increasingly, there are companies that are trying to incorporate data from ADME characteristics, adsorption, distribution, metabolism, expression characteristics based on historical data for similar molecules, etc., and design particular molecular structures that possibly have a better efficacy profile or a safety profile. So these are the kind of things we are talking about. Like in a nutshell, we are talking about machine learning, allowing this iterative discovery to happen really fast, considering a far larger range of constraints, and allowing for this candidate generation or lead generation to happen in a much more streamlined manner than was ever possible in human history.
So expanding on that, could we say that there could be potential for, let's say, a doctor to have a patient who has a very rare condition or even a condition which they haven't diagnosed yet, and to use AI to develop a drug very, very quickly, which is specifically targeted to the exact needs of the patient's disease immediately?
So I'm not sure about the immediately part, but then again, that is something that we can discuss about later. But in a much more tractable time scale, yes. I mean, what you're talking about is essentially the core of precision medicine, that you are considering the patient as an individual with their own individual genomic, metabolic, proteomic, and environmental and demographic history, and using that to essentially propose what appropriate therapeutic interventions might be proposed for specific conditions that they may have. And we do see an emergence of this line of thinking for a lot of specific kinds of cancers, for example, where there is a lot of understanding that, targeted therapeutic interventions are most likely to succeed, in a longer term than having generic kind of like therapeutic administrations that are essentially estimated on a population scale or essentially estimated using kind of like a symptomatic approach. So in theory, yes, I mean, the future clinic should be able to be precise in terms of the therapy that it proposes for individual patients, and algorithms that are able to integrate all of this patient level information will play a critical role in it. And essentially, my hunch is that the way this will end up working in practice is that while patient profiles would be mapped by algorithms to suggest appropriate lines of treatment, the actual treatments themselves will be chosen from a catalog of options that are created for different patient phenotypes, as opposed to making it strictly individual and designing a therapy right on the spot.
Okay. I mean, from what I have understood, we see a huge shift towards personalized medicine. So medicine being specific to the exact needs of the patient, because every organism is different. Everyone's organism works in a different way. With cholesterol, some people are affected from high cholesterol, some people are not affected this much from high cholesterol, and so on.
Yeah, something to think about here is this. We talk a lot about, precision medicine in the context of things already being wrong in the sense that the patient already having become a patient. But we could think of it more on a holistic healthcare side as well. Like, like how do you actually precisely tailor proactive healthcare for individual needs? So, for example, I'm a South Asian individual, and because of my unique genetic history and because of my, the unique epigenetic manifestations thereof, I am more susceptible to, let's say, cardiac events and things like diabetes, etc., than the average population in the West, just to give an example. And therefore, there is no reason why I need to be prescribed the exact same dietary interventions or the exact same fitness routines in my routine fitness checks or the routine healthcare checks as everybody else. So I would think that the precision medicine should come in on more on the preventive and the proactive side and on the reactive side.
Yeah, yeah. No, I certainly agree. Is that happening, or could that happen in the next couple of years?
So that is happening. Like you do have essentially a lot more activity in that direction in the space of like startups and ventures and more on the wellness side of things rather than in the, you know, the healthcare administration side of things. More health systems, while they talk about it, at a surface level, but purely in terms of a more proactive deployment, we still have some miles to go.
All right, all right. So, in terms of drug manufacturing, how exactly are you using AI yourself when it comes to the process of drug manufacturing?
Well, I mean, as it comes to manufacturing as a process itself, like you have, I mean, very clear needs when it comes to things like addressing quality concerns, addressing supply chain efficiencies, addressing the like assembly line efficiencies, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
So,
if I'm not mistaken, I think I had read in a meta analysis that about 90% of drugs fail in clinical trials.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, clinical trials come way before the manufacturing even begins. So that's a whole different, story that we are talking about. But like, talk about manufacturing first. So, for example, something as simple as, whether or not there is an overflow of pills when you're filling it into a jar. You have essentially cameras monitoring it in a lot of like shop floors. Even monitoring and analyzing this kind of a thing today, you can have algorithms to do that. So something as simple to more complicated things around supply chain optimization and scheduling efficiency optimization and predictive maintenance in the shop floor. All of those things, like in other industries, by the way, you do have this in other industries as well. We do see a fair amount of like, value creation using machine learning or generally AI systems. Speaking of clinical trial design, that is a whole process in itself. Like one of the core concerns that we have when you design clinical trials is appropriately recruiting the relevant subjects and creating the subject and the control cohorts. And you'd be surprised how bad people are at answering questions about themselves in these kind of things. So I've seen all kinds of like, I mean, some of the papers I've reviewed in this space in a lot of these AI conferences, I've seen all kinds of things like there was this paper that talked about actually having mobile camera apps that would require clinical trial subjects to record videos of them taking a pill and then uploading it so that the AI could assess that whether or not they took the pill at the right amount of time and actually took the pill for that matter before they reported what their symptoms or remissions thereof were. So as such, like a lot of these are essentially human factors adjustments that we need to consider during making selections for clinical trial cohorts, and that is where machine learning plays a lot of a role. And also like a lot of the chatbots that are used today to actually do some of this recruitment, there is a lot of scope for having LLM powered systems based on historical data for patient creation and patient, cohort selection. You have companies doing it, like you have clinical trial providers like IQVIA, etc., that do offer this kind of competency from what I know.
Yeah, yeah. So how about responsibility and its role in all of this conversation? Let's say that an AI makes a huge error and it fails. Is that the responsibility of AI or the person who trained it?
Yeah, so this is something where the jurisprudence is not very clear yet. I mean, you do have a lot of talk about treating this essentially as a case of intermediary responsibility, but given that a lot of these algorithms essentially come with a fairly black box kind of like a formalism where you do not have first principles way of explaining a lot of their decision making, there isn't exactly a clear jurisprudence on what the chain of responsibility should be. So a lot of the focus has been like, if you look at the OECD guidelines about, risks of using AI systems, etc., a lot of the EU guidelines around the AI Act and so on and so forth, all of that focuses heavily on this idea on the that let's actually not focus so much on who is responsible when AI gets something wrong, etc. But let's actually regulate the usage side itself. Like if an AI were to get something wrong, then what is the potential harm that may be caused in different sectors? And accordingly, let's actually regulate to what extent AI agents can be used as parts of the process. So that right is the way of looking at it, where you are not really talking about individual responsibility, but you're kind of like saying that, okay, let's not use these systems where such a compliance issue might in itself. Not best approach in my understanding either, but I don't see a lot of other options if you have to run a very advanced, sort
Mm.
of responsibility have to be assigned to someone. So
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that AI could potentially be much more productive than humans? Not necessarily because of higher intelligence, but because it lacks the emotional aspect of ego, of something wrong because of emotional purposes and not, you know, productivity wise.
well, I mean, we are assuming that most valuable human activities are devoid of those human emotional, manifestations. In those areas where that is true, maybe you'll have AI systems being more efficient. Usually these would be boring, repetitive tasks that can be automated anyway. But if you're talking about, once again, we're talking about things like creative aspiration, creative output earlier, we're talking about things where,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, organizing human beings, leveraging this ability of manipulating or organizing large groups of humans. Those are all things that are fundamentally rely on the expression of those very emotions.
So both in the pharmaceutical industry and outside, are there jobs which are bulletproof from being replaceable from AI? Like psychologist is the most popular case, which is being made all the time, that it's gonna be fully bulletproof from being replaced. But do you think there could be something there?
So I'll tell you an anecdote. I mean, in my first year in Oxford, I met a Nobel laureate in economics, Michael Spence, and this was in 2017, and there was a lot of discussion about the future of work. And I had asked him a question: to what extent did Michael Spence think that his job as an economist could be replaced by an AI? And what he said to me was that, look, no AI can ever model human irrationality, which is what economists do. So my job is bulletproof. So all jobs that have to navigate human irrationality and human quirks cannot really be replaced by algorithms.
Mm. Okay, okay. Uh, how far do you think we are in AI? For example, I have one of my best friends does trading quite successfully, and he has told me that so far, from what he has seen in all the communities of successful traders and all that stuff, is that every person who tried to create an AI model to do trading has failed. And by failed, I mean not necessarily not being successful, but at least not as successful as.
A human trader, largely, you're not going to beat the human trader. Look, most market movements are once again a manifestation of human irrationality. Markets are hardly,
Mm,
at least at let's say moments in time, markets are hardly rational. So markets are more of a very dynamic manifestation of human irrationality and human emotion. So you can't really have algorithms mimic that, no matter what you do.
is it not possible to program this into AI?
Not really. I mean, we cannot really define things, and what we cannot define, we cannot really program. What is tantalizing, what is tantalizing as a possibility is that can this itself be an emergent behavior when you have large, large algorithms trained on large amounts of data with infinite compute, let's say, as a thought experiment? Will there be emergent behaviors that can mimic this kind of a human irrationality or human emotion or human decision making? That's a million.
What do you think?
Well, I think there are two possibilities here really. That if you have, let's say, limited amount of data, essentially all the data that is there in the world, and you have a large enough model, then you are really looking at the model kind of overfitting on that data itself. Now, within that data would obviously be patterns and stories of all kinds of human activity including human irrationality and emotion and whatnot. So as such, there is a possibility that there would be some display of what we might think of as emergent behavior, But will it actually be able to scale to a novel scenario in the wild would be the question then.
All right, all right. Do you think AI lessons should be incorporated more in psychology degrees and the humanities?
Well, absolutely. Look, I mean, the field of psychology was kind of like the initiator of a lot of the concepts that power
Mm.
AI today. So if the cognitive psychologists have not decided to look into how AI is progressing as a field, then they are kind of letting go of their own academic legacy.
Yeah, I remember watching a very interesting idea from a podcast of Jordan Peterson in terms of reality being a form of a narrative story, and how the postmodernists first introduced this as an idea, but it was also taken up in the first developers of AI, because AI, if I'm not mistaken, 'cause I don't know how it works, but um, it uses a narrative story to interpret what reality is. And there is a theory that we also do the same, and we just don't have a lot of ways of being sure. But
So yeah, one of the more common ways of expressing that I've heard is that fundamentally a lot of our transactions with reality are essential endless series of post hoc rationalizations that we essentially look at an effect and then manufacture the cause. That
mm,
is what most of our transactions with or interactions with our ideas of reality look like. And I've seen this being extrapolated to clinical contexts, when it comes to like doing
in
AI in
what
health.
way?
So this idea that a lot of clinicians, for example, when they actually kind of like, let's say, treat a patient, a lot of their causal understanding of the set of symptoms of the disease is informed by what they see, essentially the effect that they see, kind of like lets them to formulate the cause, in a sense, engaging in post hoc rationalization, which algorithms effectively do in a sense that they kind of like come up with a certain judgment and without really explaining the process right off the bat. I mean, I don't buy this in the clinical context, because you are kind of like not really factoring in the idea that there is essentially years of expertise and years of like, experience driven insights that also go into the process. But imagine an algorithm that could essentially bring that element together with kind of like the pattern recognition capability, then that would not be very different from this idea of post hoc rationalization. So in a sense, I tend to agree with this idea that a lot of our perceptions of reality can be explained this manner. But once again, like, personally,
The problem of definition.
exactly, the problem of
Yeah.
definition does exist. Like, this is when you have any scientific discussion around machine learning or AI or whatever, this is a perennial problem that we don't have a standardized set of definitions. And when you do have these discussions bringing in insights from psychology or philosophy, there is often, once again, a paucity of like very well grounded and very well bounded definitions. So that's I think a bit of a problem that will have to be epistemically resolved.
Is there a possibility of making the definitions more clear and specific, or no?
There is a possibility. I mean, if we can actually embark on a journey of standardization of some sort, like this is something that the research communities need to come together and create a consensus for. It's easier said than done, because the AI research community has been increasing at an exponential pace in the last few years. I mean, this is one field where, you can have decades of research coming out in days. I mean, so that is
But
quite difficult.
how different is that from the normal scientific procedure? Because, for example, in physics, for pretty much all the main theories, the most important ones, there was a time where they couldn't even define what they're talking about. Very, very recently, for example, quantum dynamics started occurring in theories and being expressed in mathematical ways. But in physics, they also say sometimes that we don't know what we're talking about. So let's create a model which is not necessarily accurate, but at least it could allow us to do research on it. This could be either creating more dimensions mathematically or anything. So is it actually something new, or is it the same exact?
Yeah, look, I mean, the core difference here is this. Like, when you look at a lot of modern physics, you have had that same epistemic problem that we were really dealing with, things that we could not adequately explain from a first principles basis. And we had to create those superstructures that allowed us to, interact with those ideas and concepts. And that has been the case with a lot of the AI development in the last 10 years or so as well. The difference is that like a lot of the similar emergences in physics, you have had things like that happen like once every few years. Here for today's modern machine learning and AI research, you have that kind of a thing that is happening pretty much every few days. And that is what actually makes it quite difficult to actually, you know, have any tractable discussion on kind of like setting some of these baselines in order.
All right. Let's take a small step back from AI because I want to talk about something which is not directly related, but it could be the concept of immortality and the fact that we see a lot of talk about immortality, specifically Brian Johnson, a lot of the other guys in social media and scientific communication all the time. What do you think about it generally?
No, I mean, but when I hear about immortality and this desire for being immortal, I think about that Greek poem of, I think this was Tithonus, where I think like, Tithonus asked for immortality from Eos and forgot to ask for like forever youth and got immortality, but would never stop aging and then eventually had to be converted into a grasshopper. So in a sense, I always think that is it worth being immortal? Like,
Yeah, because you lose sense of the life you're living now.
exactly like,
The Latin saying of memento mori, that you're gonna die and it should wake you up to live your life now. Yeah. Do you think there could be potential for actual immortality?
like as a theoretical end goal, potentially, yes. I mean, let's not talk about immortality itself, but if you were to look at a lot of the research on longevity itself, like we do have a fair amount of research today in terms of understanding, particular sort of, for example, genes like ATK1, etc., that have been implicated in particular aspects of like cell apoptosis and things like that. And you do have kind of like pathways that are understood in the direction, and therefore you have essentially an ability to modulate particular parts of the pathway to, modulate cell apoptosis itself. Then you do, as a result, you do have this ability today of expanding your lifespan than what it would otherwise be. Now, what is the theoretical upper limit to that is a question that we cannot adequately answer today. So I think like one of the things to think about here is also this, that you have Brian Johnson, for example, like, a lot of this talk about Project Blueprint and things like that, where if you were to look at a lot of the things that he does about, using blood plasma and, making dietary modifications and things like that, a lot of those
For some context for the people who are not familiar, Brian Johnson received a plasma transfusion from his son, and he also donated his plasma to his father. And he claims that he made his father like solve a lot of his health issues and also make him biologically much younger, and himself too.
Yeah. Honestly, I have some reservations about things like plasma transfers. But if you look at some of the other aspects of, manipulating or modulating your diet in a manner that is, let's say, devoid of processed foods and things like that, those are very common sense measures, really, to in terms of like, enhancing your quality of life in general. Uh, that way, like, if you can live a metabolically healthy lifestyle, you would anyway add a few years to your life without you realizing it in a lot of cases. For example, like if you live in a, let's say, in a city that is quite polluted, has very poor air quality, as opposed to living somewhere in the Alps, with pristine and clean air, all else being equal, your lifespan, when the air is, much, you know, much more enhanced. So there are some of these more common sense approaches that, people can very easily adopt. But purely in terms of having more clinical modifications towards longevity, I think the most promising aspect here would be having these gene therapy interventions and
Mm.
target particular genes that are
He was,
implicated.
I think, Brian Johnson was the first person to actually receive a gene editing therapy.
Yes, I think there are quite a few of, offerings now out there. So yesterday I attended a talk. So we have an Oxford Society for Aging and Longevity here, and they organized a talk by Patrick Sewell yesterday, and he was talking about his startup offering some of these gene therapy offerings for longevity enhancement. Like they have this whole suite of treatments that you can have, and a lot of them essentially target like, say for example, those genes that are implicated in things like cell apoptosis or those aspects that can actually reduce telomere shortening and things like that. So I do see promise in those, as in terms of like, all else being equal, reducing, sort of like, or maybe enhancing your life, sorry, not reducing, enhancing your lifespan, etc. And once again, I guess the bigger question to ask is that when you talk about longevity, it's important to talk about the quality of life that is inherent in such longevity as well. So that I think is a thing that people need to think about.
Yeah, and what many people need to think about is that they hyper focus on what pills Brian Johnson takes, and they're like this technology, where they don't have their sleep in order, they don't have their mental health in order, their relationships in order, their clean air, the good food, and I mean, you do have to appreciate it what Brian Johnson does.
Most of the Mediterranean, all the cases where we see of people that have lived beyond the age of 100, all of them have said that you need to smoke a few packs of cigarettes a day and drink as much red wine as possible. So,
Yeah, yeah. And
no,
it doesn't say necessarily that it's the smoking which increases the longevity. It's that most of their life is healthy food, healthy fats, healthy protein. Some nations, to be honest, are on the vegan side and they live tons of years. Some nations eat tons of meat and they live a lot of years. I think what is common to all the nations is that they eat real food and live a healthy life in
it's
nature.
we're talking about precision medicine earlier.
Mm.
There is a strong case to be made here that purely on the view of longevity, a lot of people blindly copy Brian Johnson, which is stupid because everyone is different at a fundamental level. And this is one of those cases when I was talking about that precision medicine needs to be more proactive, kind of ties to this that, what kind of a diet is most suitable for you depends a lot on your, evolutionary history really and on your present environmental conditions.
How did you discover that? Is it a trial and error concept where you just try different diets and different life modes and you decide on what works best?
You can look at your own family history, honestly. I mean, today you have a lot of ability to actually do gene sequencing and omics sequencing at scale. So you can actually come up with, there are startups offering this as a service, come up with appropriate kinds of diets for, a healthy lifestyle and so on and so forth. But an easy, dumb way of doing that is to look at your own family history
Mm.
and look at that, why those diets were created in a particular environment that you have come from. And why is it that you have particular issues like, some people have tremendous issues losing fat, me included. It is important to understand those in the evolutionary and the historical context. I'll give you an example. Most Indian cuisine today, like most of North Indian cuisine, this is one of the most carbohydrate heavy cuisines in the world. It has been so for the last, based on archaeological evidence, anywhere between 3 to 5,000 years now. The reason for that is that this is one part of the world which had a very early onset of the agricultural revolution over a large extent of land, over fertile river valleys of the Indus and the Ganga, which is a very large expanse of land with immense carrying capacity. So, what happened as a result was that there was no reason for populations that had settled in those parts of the world to continue with the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and they had a very early adoption of the sedentary lifestyle. Why? And because there was a very easy availability of carbohydrate-based food sources, that became the predominant source of food, that release of quick energy, which also became important because of the lifestyle that was required in that kind of a setting, like the farming lifestyle in such a hot and humid climate effectively means working for 10 hours. And if you have like 2 or 3 crop cycles, doing that pretty much year round, so toiling with heavy equipment for 10 hours in the long, you cannot really do that without a carb heavy diet of 3000 calories and above.
You
And
also
which,
see it, for example, in Scandinavia, where they eat a lot of omega-3 high fish, fatty fish, because they need to keep themselves warm, especially in the winter months. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that is where that diet evolved in that kind of a context.
Mm.
And if you were to look at today's Indians who work essentially out of offices, who don't really come anywhere close to a farm, than maybe driving by one someday, once in a while, if they continue with those exact same diets, where are those carbs going to go exactly? So as a result, you have a huge skinny fat problem in a lot of the urban Indian population. And this started with this idea that a lot of Indian populations, like mine included, have had a history of facing famines at an unpredictable notice. We have kind of epigenetically evolved to have extra fat reserves, which makes
Mm.
it very difficult unless you're really, really careful to actually, not sort of end up storing fat if you deviate from it, even slightly beyond that 2000 calorie mark or thereabouts. So you have to artificially ensure that your diet has extra protein and you are doing weight training to actually train your body that, you are not going to have a famine anytime soon. So it is important to understand, the context of how the specific diets that you consume predominantly evolved to actually make changes based on the material difference in lifestyles that you have had as a result, whatever external modifications, etc., that have happened. So that is something that you can do fairly easily. That how what your ancestors ate and under what conditions. So that is not difficult. You could always have a lot of sequencing data available and use algorithms to predict what is an appropriate diet. But I doubt the outcome would be much more different than otherwise.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think it's a huge problem of the social media aspect where everybody goes and says his own story. But at the end of the day, if you have research pointing towards a direction, but if I see somebody who tells me that he's on the keto diet or on the vegan diet, I don't care, and he tells me that he actually has tons of energy, feels great, sleeps great, he's able to live his best life, I can't really argue that it's not the best thing for him because I read something.
If it works for you, great. I mean, there is no one size fits all anyway. So if you have somehow discovered what works for you, great. I mean, I feel that a lot of these things should be done with a little more clinical understanding of yourself, because you never really know what those unintended consequences of a sudden, transition might be. So there is that aspect. But otherwise, yeah, if it works.
Which also goes back to the personalization of medicine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But how about mechanisms? Like the cholesterol mechanism is one of the most popular now in the health sciences. But you also see different things which we hadn't discovered, like the hormone of cholesterol, which we saw is responsible for a lot of the functions of cholesterol. And you also see it in patients who are like obese, let's say, or metabolically unhealthy, and they lose weight, and you actually see their cholesterol going up instead of down because the liver understands that it needs to produce more fat because it was conditioned in that way. While they are being more healthy and they're improving their health, you see different markers like cholesterol going up. And the average doctor, it's very sad that he would say that, oh, his cholesterol is going up, let's put him on medication straight away, when it's just a response.
Yeah, so that's why that's why I say, when you have a lot of these interventions that you wish to make with your life, it's important to actually consult someone who knows what they're talking about, because it's crucial. Because you always have, say, for example, the body reacting to sudden changes in your dietary or environmental conditions, and some of these things may cause confusion, to the average clinician or to the average healthcare worker, and that's not always a positive thing.
Yeah, a lot of it goes back to strong foundations. But yeah, one last thing I want to mention about AI is the imaging aspect. What is happening right now with AI in terms of medical imaging to find cancers and other health conditions?
Okay, so look, my PhD was on AI and medical imaging. So it was on AI for second trimester ultrasound. And I have to say this, I mean, I will take a bit of a less than optimistic view that, this is one of those areas that has been long on promise and short on delivery.
Yeah, I remember you had also told me that at some point.
I have essentially a research community that goes on guns blazing on the latest algorithm that they have that makes a 5% improvement in some specific kind of medical imaging tasks, like segmenting, let's say, the left ventricle of the heart and whatnot, using the fanciest of architectures possible. But the question that I ask, when I see these things is, so what? So, seriously, I mean, you have a really well curated data set. You train let's say, a heavy duty algorithm on it, which has a significant computational footprint, and then you achieve an accuracy improvement of like 3%. You create a problem, saying that, okay, data privacy is important. So how do we train data that is in different parts of the world? And let's do federated learning. And here is this fancy new architecture of doing, once again, federated learning in some form or the other. You write a paper, you have peer reviewers who come from that similar mindset, who appreciate your paper, etc., etc. And that paper just, it becomes yet another addition to the ivory tower. Once again, not answering the question, so what? The problem is this: to actually have deployments of AI in the clinic, you need to have at least some level of reproducibility or some level of tractability and generalization that can be, faithfully guaranteed across health systems. So that is not something that we have seen any substantial measure with a lot of like, these uh, artificial intelligence systems for a lot of imaging workflows. There are some exceptions to that in very particular circumstances, though.
Yeah.
Say, for example, a lot of the workflows that essentially are meant to do first pass diagnostics. Say, for example, if you're looking at, let's say, breast cancer radiographs, and then you have an algorithm that highlights some lesions here and there, then there is a lot of a case to be made that eventually, if you were to use these with, sort of a clinical personnel being present, then that can be a win-win for everyone. So effectively, if you can have these as assistive technologies, then that may be something that we can essentially faithfully rely on in the clinic. And thankfully, today, regulators have increasingly appreciated the role of AI as an assistive technology rather than buying into this hype that AI will replace radiologists and that nonsense. That
Yeah. Yeah.
have, like, for example, AI kind of help you delineate things like the left ventricle of the heart when you are calculating ejection fraction in a clinic, etc. And the human clinician can override that AI decision and go forward on the process. So, as an assistive technology, I see promise there, but purely to actually, I do not hold any candle to the hype that a lot of very towering figures in the field have been proposing for no good reason over the last few years.
Yes, yes. I think a lot of talk about it comes from a naive perspective on how the human body works as well. I don't think we're at a point where we can fully rely on AI to cure patients. Like at least for the next few years. And it also goes back to the longevity because you hear all the time that, oh, in the next century, we'll have found the way to live to 200 years. At the moment, I reviewed a lot of the literature, not all of it, but a lot. I haven't seen anything which promises a huge dramatic change in longevity in the next few years. And let's say that you do find one, how many experimental trials do you need to do, and how many regulation procedures do you need to go through?
For longevity specifically, how do you even design a trial? That's a question. What are your control groups going to be? So yeah, that's some of these things. I mean, I guess the way we do clinical trials and the way we actually understand the whole drug discovery and approval process, that itself maybe need to be revamped when you talk about things like longevity and gene therapy for enhancing longevity and those kind of like interventions.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough, fair enough. Right. I think that covers it for what we discussed about AI and healthcare. But I want to hear about your trip to India and also about how it feels like to have traveled to more than 90 countries. I think 90, 92. How many is it now?
Three now, yeah.
93 countries. Yeah.
So the important thing is that particularly the travel aspect, like it's kind of like a liberation for me because I hold an Indian passport, which is not particularly powerful in terms of mobility. So for me, travel is a way of like, kind of fighting back in a sense. It's kind of being a rebel to this system. I mean, I did not choose to be born with a passport that I am, and it's imperative on me to kind of challenge it to the extent possible. And which is what this whole urge to travel. I mean, come to think of it, like this whole urge to explore your surroundings, this urge to see other cultures, meet other people, that's evolutionarily ingrained in us. It's deeply atavistic. That
Yeah,
is how,
and we've seen it in history with Alexander the Great. We saw it with
yeah, even the Paduda with a lot of these sailors from the Bronze Age in the civilizations who would be trading with Mesopotamia and whatnot.
mm,
So,
mm. Yeah, there
it's
appears to be a
that,
need in human nature to explore. But a lot of your travel also happens for lectures, right?
yes, a lot of it happens for lectures and work. And I try to optimize those to see as much as possible. And I try to actually stay in the homes of locals in different places as much as possible as well.
Mm.
Something that I don't always mention, but this is something I very actively try to actually meet as many locals and try and stay in the homes or of locals. And sometimes if that is not possible, I try to make friends with people who are in universities locally and stay in university dorms, etc. Which is the next thing you can do if you can't find a local to stay with to understand the local culture.
What has been your if you had to describe what you've seen in terms of that, having traveled worldwide now in one sentence, what would it be?
Well. Humans are very curious, They are all the same and all the different at the same time.
Mm.
And that's
In what way specifically?
You could sit down with pretty much anyone in the world, and after a couple of rounds of beer or any suitable intoxicants,
Mm.
you would be discussing about similar things. Trust me not. You'll be discussing about girls, about love, about breakups, about disappointments, about ego, and so on and so forth. And yet, you would be coming from very different surroundings, very different upbringings, and very different cultures. So a lot of this talk about, that there is always a cultural baggage that people carry. I don't think so. That cultural baggage is just the icing on the cake, and the cake is nearly similar for everyone. So the basic core of humanity and human emotion, that's very universal.
Yeah, I mean, you see that when people travel to a different culture with the aim to stay there, either for studies at a university or a transferring job, you also have the Berry's acculturation model in psychology, which basically says that some people experience that more positively, some people have a harder time. In general, I think it's one of the best things to do to see different parts of the world, which also take you away from very conservative standpoints of how you see black and white all the time, I think.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, for whatever reason, people do create walls around them, which kind of limits your thinking and your vision. And in a sense, it limits the ability to grow yourself. I mean, look, there is no reason. I mean, if you are someone sitting in a particular part of the world, what's a good reason you have to, for no reason, have preconceived notions about someone you have never met and never interacted with? So that's something that I think, people need to be a lot more in touch with their inner wanderer, their inner nomad. We are a nomadic species. The reason we have spread all over the world in such a manner is because we are fundamentally a nomadic species. We were able to flexibly cooperate in large numbers. I use that phrase a lot, but that is what it is. And be the forever nomads that we were. That is what makes us human. I mean, that is what makes us different. That is the fundamental manifestation of our own being. So
That's
yeah,
very powerful. Yeah, yeah.
I also like, obviously, one of the other things I do is that I pet cats in every country.
Mm.
And in every country, cats are more or less similar. So that's always a joy to see.
Yeah. All right. All right. I don't have anything else to add. I think it was a fairly full conversation covering a lot of topics. I don't know if there is anything more you need to say or you want to express.
Not really. I mean, one of the things that we do need to think about today, I mean, we are once again at a cusp of history where you have a lot of our understanding of ourselves being rewritten at a very fast notice, both at an individual level and at a geopolitical level and at a technological level. I think it is a moment that is very fitting where we once again re-establish that contract that we have with ourselves and with largest humanity, and understand what our place in this new order is going to be. Be it in
Based on that, what is one thing everybody should keep in mind?
I think the one thing is, that thing that we're just discussing, that it's important not to build walls around yourself. I think that is important.
All right, that's fair. That's fair.